Hello. I'm glad to be here with you folks this evening. My name, hello, my name's Jeff Curtis, and it's great to be here with you folks, all my buddies from the San Francisco Theosophical Lodge, and anybody else who happens to come by and be interested in joining us in this series of talks that I've been doing now for a while, going on a year. I think this is like the 1 year anniversary, more or less, of when Richard talked me into starting to do these remote sessions with you folks. Um, I'm going a little bit. I'm going a little bit slow here in the beginning, seeing a couple of error messages. I hope they don't mean anything. Um, and I'm also going slow to give a couple people a chance to be a minute or two late. As you know, I've been coming to you with talks about a personal interest of my own, which is to update you on news of and topics in the science of consciousness and the way in which scientific methods are being brought to bear on that topic, as well as insights from other realms of work, inner work, psychology, meditation. It all forms a big, seamless, beautiful whole, of course. And one of the things I keep saying over and over again is that we don't even have a good working definition for consciousness. It tends to be very discipline specific, the way people will decide what it means, what it is. And so that ends up meaning that arguments ensue that can be kind of fun to listen to if you're at a conference or what have you. But I'm not going to try to limit things down. I tend to try to open things up when I talk about them. I have also been trying to serve as just sort of a general conduit for news from science, from the realm of science that might be of general interest. So perhaps I'm going to have to change the title of these talks and make it news from consciousness, science of consciousness, and then maybe just science in general. And one of the things I've been talking about now and then in these meetings together has to do with climate change and climate science and the way in which that obviously affects everything. That COVID pandemic, other current events have made us for a kind of a tough couple years. This has been a challenging period of time to be a human on planet Earth. Lots of things to worry about, lots of adjustments to make. People have been going through things and in a stressed state. And so some of my focus as I pick and choose from areas of science have to do with impacts on the general mental health. Where I can find it, I look for positive news in the context of climate science and what's going on there in the news with climate science. Because some of you may watch the news to the point of realizing that fairly recently there's been a release of another one of these reports from the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, I think is what it stands for. And I'm not going to go into any kind of long listing about what it says there. Just I'll summarize it with buckle up. Things we've known for a long time. We have a challenge on our hands. And it's a difficult technical challenge. We have to rearrange the energy structure, energy balance, the way in which energy is being used and distributed on planet Earth, and then think about ways to mitigate upcoming changes. And it can be daunting. And I'm not going to focus on the daunting as much as the fact that, hey, we're humans, we're smart, we have science, and things are taking place. I've talked about this before a few times. So I wanted to open today with just a little bit of sort of interesting and at least marginally good news coming in from the realm of science in that regard. So you guys know that one of my main modalities of staying in touch, I take a bunch of magazines. I read most of them, not always every time. One of the ones that I like a lot and that I am showing up to you guys a lot in the course of these talks that we have together is this magazine called The New Scientist. It's a weekly, it's very, very high quality, comes out. I usually read the thing almost front to cover, looking for topics along the lines of the stuff that I enjoy. Well, ran across something. This is a bit of a good news story in the field of science as it applies to climate change adaptations and how we are dealing with things like crop yields, because crop yields turn out to be a persistent challenge as we try to adapt and move our society forward in terms of being able to feed more and more people on a planet that's more and more constrained and ailing in various ways. So what's interesting to me, it always is, as a scientist, is how big discoveries just come along out of the blue in formats you would never suspect, when you would never suspect. Well, here's one of those. If I can hold this up so it's readable, covering plants with red plastic boosts crop yields. That's a huge big deal. And let me give you a few particulars. This doesn't just mean red light filtering plastic, but rather plastic with a specific type of a fluorescent dye in it, which means that it looks red to the eye. And if you stretch a film of this stuff over a crop, the best thing they've tested so far is the plant called bok choy, which we all tend to know and love. It's a green vegetable, very nutritious and wonderful, shows up in Chinese food a lot. You can increase crop yield of bok choy by almost 40%, which is huge, if you cover it with this plastic. What this plastic does is re-emits it as red light. It's easy to think logically that plants are green, therefore they must really like green light, and the more green light you give them, the better they're going to grow. It's just the opposite. The light-absorbing apparatus in plants don't particularly use green light. They reflect it and or transmit it, and so white light that goes through a leaf or bounces off of a leaf looks rich in green light, and that's the perceptual chain of events there. So if you can absorb green light coming from the white light and then re-emit it as red light, which is a downstep in energy, that actually helps the plant grow better, to the extent of almost 40% improved crop yield for bok choy. And then for various other plants, lettuces, they talk about benefit quite a bit from this thing. Romaine lettuce in particular, butterhead lettuce. These are huge food crops, and they take up a lot of space, and they require a lot of fertilizer. And so anytime you can bump a crop yield, that means, wow, we need less space, we need less fertilizer. And that's awesome. So, hey, take that as a win. And the idea of fertilizer actually ties in with the other piece of news I wanted to bring out of the area of climate change and climate-related news, which is the recent discoveries made in the topic of something called seagrass meadows. So we all know that the oceans help regulate the carbon budget on planet Earth, and as CO2 concentrations go up in the air, CO2 is sucked into the ocean, or diffuses into the ocean, a little more scientific way of putting it, and it gets taken up, it drives biology, it gets sequestered, The biggest fraction of the CO2 that is buffered out by the ocean happens in the first like foot and a half or so of biological activity and plankton growth, which is in the very surface layer of the water. But there are other very large reservoirs of carbon and what we call carbon sinks that are there in the ocean. Well, a relatively recent discovery, and this is why it's exciting, is that we're just now figuring this out. A recent discovery is the important role of seagrass in this whole topic. So when I was a kid, I used to sometimes go camping at a beautiful aquatics park run by the YMCA down in Carlsbad, California, and there was this lagoon, and this lagoon had these intensely both beautiful and kind of ominous and a little bit scary beds of seagrass growing in the sandy shoals at the bottom of this lagoon in the saltwater. Turns out, I didn't know it, but I was coming into contact with and getting my first introduction to seagrass at the time. And it's very different than kelp. Kelp is more of a free-floating plant that sometimes it has an anchor on the seafloor with a root-like structure attached to a rock, but it's really getting all of its nutrition from the water itself, and it doesn't have roots. Seagrass grows in relatively shallow water, and it has an actual root structure, therefore with rhizomes and a whole root ecosystem that penetrates down into the sand and the silt. And it takes up a ferocious amount of carbon to form its biomass. Turns out, we didn't know this, but all this time, seagrass in shallow water shoals, and it's particularly prominent in the Mediterranean for some reason, has been responsible for maybe 25% of the CO2 uptake of the oceans. And this comes to us by virtue of hardworking marine biologists and people who are understanding these processes over the years by going out there and doing the field work. Now, a slightly disturbing piece of news is that we've also discovered that these seagrass meadows, they're called, have been in a relatively rapid state of decline. That was the second shoe to drop. And that's because of habitat disturbance. So, for example, resorts will sometimes destroy square miles of seagrass meadow because tourists don't like it. They find it scary. They find it ugly. They'd rather have a nice white sand beach and not have this stuff washing up. Okay, more importantly, agricultural runoff with fertilizer in it. Nitrate fertilizers and phosphate fertilizers come down in rivers, they hit the ocean, that stuff disseminates, and it pumps off a bloom, an algal bloom, which in a short-term sense does help pull out carbon because we're forming biomass in the water with lots of algae forming microorganisms in that upper layer that I mentioned. On the other hand, that's transient. That stuff tends to die and then release its carbon very quickly. And furthermore, it chokes out the seagrass. And so the seagrass underneath algal mats will die out, and you'll be left with essentially desertification of the seafloor in that area. Okay, that's the bad news. But the good news is now we know. And there have been a number of pilot studies now, which on a very positive note show that it is pretty easy to remediate this problem. You just stop tearing it out and you stop polluting it, and it comes back at a fairly modest but significant rate, and you can grow seagrass meadows very successfully. This seagrass stuff, on a pound-for-pound basis, sequesters carbon approximately 35 times better than tropical forests. So a lot of focus in climate science is placed upon the carbon scrubbing role of tropical forests, and also a lot of anxiety comes from the fact that those forests are being destroyed in the Brazilian Amazon, and there are various political, economic reasons that make it really hard for the rest of the world to intervene and stop that. Um, Tropical forests are under stress in wherever they are. They're under stress. People want to cut them down, use the wood, and use the soil for farmland. Well, the urgency with which we're trying to intervene on that, make a difference, stop that process, is going up. It'll go up another notch based on the latest IPCC report. But it's really good to know that we have a way of now engineering CO2 buffering capacity into the oceans that pound for pound is 35 times better than tropical rainforests. Another important thing that the seagrass meadows do locally is that they pump out oxygen. This helps to redress ocean acidification. You might have heard of the fact that CO2 overpressure causes ocean water pH to drop. That means get more acidic. And that is very bad for coral and for other kinds of organisms. So, wow, just recently, just in the last 5 minutes, we've figured out a huge, big, important contributor, how to arrest its decline, and how to now begin remediating it, pulling it in, recruiting it, and helping us to address this global phenomenon we're facing. So, yeah, team science. This is important stuff, and it's worth knowing about. So much for that. At least something we can feel good about. And I'll keep those kinds of reports coming here as we go along. Another place I want to turn my focus is, this is a little bit keeping in line with the idea of public mental health and the crisis that we have in just the degree of anxiety and worry that people are dealing with. I've now brought to you a number of different studies about different methodologies in ways in which we are learning how to cope and help people be more robust and go forward with better armed, better protected. There's some news on that front, and I wanted to alert you to just one of them. This is an article, again, in a recent New Scientist. This would be the one from March 5th of this year. This is, I believe, the most or second to the most recent issue of the thing. Now, you'll see that the topic here is chemistry to save the world. That's something I'll bring up another time. Maybe I'll go into some of the details with that. That's actually not what I'm going to talk about this time. Interesting to me as a chemist, and I enjoyed these articles. But this issue also has a big, long article that is quite fascinating about the psychological and well-being benefits of transcendent states and ways in which people up their survivability by learning how to lose themselves. So this is saying, lose yourself. And basically, it's getting to the idea that the better job we can do, or the more methodologies we have at our disposal for how to get out of our heads, out of our self-referential kind of normal bouncing from topic to topic, worry to worry state of mind, and with a very kind of consciously self-absorbed mental state, find our way to other mental states, the ones we might call mystical, the ones we might call mindfulness, or the kinds of benefits that come from equanimity training, flow states, these kinds of states of mind that now, by virtue of brain imaging, we have better and better handles on what they look like functionally in the MRI scans of people. You can tell if they're in an anxious, highly self-referential, monkey mind kind of state, or if there are hints of something deeper, quieter, and more regulated going on. Well, this is a whole long article about exactly that topic. And it's worth picking it up. So if you see the New Scientist magazine in the newsstand, this one will still, I believe, be on the newsstands. Now, it talks about a number of modalities that help people get there. The kinds of brain changes or patterns of neural activity that I'm talking about have now been identified. They have to do with ways of increasing certain parts of frontal lobe activity, parietal lobe activity, and pulling down the activity of an interconnected set of brain structures called the default mode network. Um, these are the changes in one form or another that tend to be measurable and visible if people practice mindfulness meditation or equanimity meditation or yoga or even transcendental meditation. Other ways in which people are now learning, or how practitioners are learning how to guide people to healing states that involve these kinds of brain changes. Most recently, there's been a great deal of work with psilocybin administered at fairly stiff dosages in a supervised setting, maybe once or twice, can help a person experience months of benefit in terms of accessing these greater, these more transcendent and less self-referential mental states. There is a very interesting story that is part of what caused me to just love this article and really get into it. It told the story of a particular guy named Jay Sanguinetti, who is a professor of neuroscience at the University of Arizona. He's been interested in this field for a long time. And in this particular article, it tells the story of him having met and be lucky enough to engage in some discussion with the Dalai Lama at a conference devoted to neuroscience and brain science in 2007 that took place in Washington, D.C. And the interesting topic came up, and this is just lovely. It is kind of surprising. So in the course of the conversation, he was talking about advances like what I'm going on about. And the Dalai Lama, who is a very adventurous guy, he brought the mind of the exact opposite of a traditionalist, stodgy, stick-in-the-mud guy. He basically was all about, well, okay, you, Professor of Neuroscience, what can you do so that I can meditate less every day? So, we can make this a little more efficient. Time management. And what can we do so that beginners and people without a whole lot of time, or people who are just starting out putting their toe in the water, can have a better shot of experiencing and therefore learning to nurture the positive mental states that come from having a regular meditative practice. So in other words, how do we sort of upend, extend, and modernize this ancient tradition that I'm one of the world's foremost representatives of? I mean, what a guy. How many people think that way? Yeah. Well, Dr. Sanguinetti got to it along with a colleague, I think a fellow named Shinjin Young. And there are now popping on the radar screens of practitioners two quite new modalities to address this question. And these are a little bit less scary sounding than some of the things I've spoken to you about here before that had to do with highly effective and godsend type techniques to pull people out of bad states, but it involved putting needles in their head. This isn't that. This is non-invasive, therefore much relatively safer and certainly less expensive modalities. One of them that this fellow Sanguinetti has developed is called transcranial focused ultrasound. That's TFU. It uses pulses of ultrasonic energy that happen to be, in his case, he's found his best results when these are directed to the right inferior frontal gyrus, which I can't point exactly to it, but it's going to be in here someplace. it's a relatively small brain volume that seems to be the one that responds most favorably to this particular intervention, which is pulsed ultrasound. Now, I would imagine that this is going to require very skillful professional practitioners to deliver this, at least at first, because ultrasound can be tissue destructive if it's used at too high of a power for too long. But used at low power for short bursts, very safe. And what they're discovering is indices of improvement and MRI brain signals of the flow state, which is a very soothing kind of a healing and mood adjusting brain state that people can get into. There's multiple routes of practice to get there, but now with this technique people can get there easier. It also seemed to do good things as far as default mode network activity, which is, as I mentioned before, a way that helps change for the better moods and mental states, and pave the way towards larger, more transformative kinds of mental states. There's another sort of related type of technique called transcranial direct current stimulation. So this is one that involves electrode placement on the outside and running of low voltage, low amperage electric currents through the scalp. That one I still need to learn a little bit more about. It's called TDCS, transcranial direct current stimulation. Maybe I'll try to have a dedicated presentation to that sometimes. I'm sort of interested in it myself, partly because I think I can build something to do that in my garage if I'm just kind of careful about it. I'm just kind of personally interested in that one. So, yeah, more to come. We are we're learning. We're going forward. We're making progress. There are smart people on the case and trying to figure out how to make things better. Along those lines, I happen to be attracted to an article in, let's see, this would be, May 22nd of 2021. And this was an article about climate change and adaptations to climate change. Written by a woman named Kimberly Nicholas, who's a climate scientist and has a lot to say. I'm really not going to go deeply into this article, but there was a quote in here that I just loved, and I'm going to see if I can get it to show up on the screen. Nobody knows if we can pull this off, but what is humanly possible is what humans make possible. I love that quote because it's the opposite of defeatism. It's the opposite of letting the bad news overwhelm and paralyze and distract to the point of harm, to the point where forward progress comes to a halt. We got to have that. We got to have a can-do spirit. We can't let ourselves be beat down, as tempting as that can be. We live in a time of very considerable challenge. I think I'll just kind of briefly turn to that here for a minute and say something about it. Obviously, the most recent news that we're all dealing with is particularly hard to take because it includes just so much suffering on the part of the people in Ukraine. It's truly heartrending, and it's easy to go into overload. I certainly have a few times lately, and I'm trying to pull myself back and count the hours that I'm spending on the bummer patrol because there's an infinite amount of it coming at us. Important not to get overwhelmed. And I'm just going to offer you a thought that I've been bringing to this moment in time, as awful as it is. Not like I have any particular insight on the exact details of how this ends or how we get out of it, but this will end. The world will arrive at the end of this episode in one form or another. And a particular aspect of this horror show is just how showy it is, just how exquisitely alert the world is to this situation. Even many very brave people in Russia are exquisitely alert. They're going out and getting arrested in droves. So this tragedy that is rolling forward is going to be one of the most seared in, etched, understood, witnessed acts of barbarity in the course of human history. And so what's likely to come from that? Well, I could list a whole bunch of bad things, but as I look at it and try to modulate my own response to it, I will tell you that I try to at least keep in mind the strong possibility, if not deep inevitability, actually that's more how I'm looking at it, that we're being given a reason to grow up like we haven't had in a long time. The amount of publicity, the consciousness, the prevalence of these images, the stories, and they're going to be coming and coming and coming. If we ever needed a reason why we need to come together and figure out how to treat each other better and how to modulate the amount of destructive power and influence that gets concentrated in the hands of one unresponsive individual or small group, this would be it. The reason for the world to figure out how to be ruled mostly by responsive, responsible, forward-looking democracies we've never had a better case than what we're seeing happen right now. And you can tell that I come up with reasons to try to look on an optimistic long-term view of things, scientifically and otherwise, and I have one here, which is that connecting with our future selves, our future culture that has had the benefit to look back on what we're going through right now, I think there's every reason to believe we're going to be improved for it. We're going to be better for it. Having gone through this vastly increases the odds that we won't have to go through it again. And so we'll go forward on that. I'll encourage you to at least contemplate bringing that idea into your own response matrix to this whole situation. And then I have some other stuff here, but I don't want to go on too long, and I think I'm just going to close with a brief mention of a book recommendation. There's a particularly beautiful book that I've been reading lately. It's called Limitless Mind. It's by a fellow named Russell Targ. He was one of the fellows who came up with the science of remote viewing as it was developed in the scientific establishment known as SRI. Stanford Research International is what that stood for back in the day, when he was there with a fellow scientist named Hal Puthoff. And they essentially figured out how to pragmatically apply and utilize the distributed nature of mind, the now inarguable, established beyond all doubt fact that our minds are not instantiated in space and time as squarely and securely in one little local volume of space-time as we had thought. We have access to information that transcends time and transcends space. We don't know how. That's being worked out. It's a really interesting story. And that has been part of Russell Targ's life work, is characterizing this. And I have another friend of mine that I've gotten to know. This is a fellow named Ed May, who is just a wonderful guy. He's a friend I met through our fellow lodge friend named Clee Irwin. And so Ed May has educated me a great deal as to the ins and outs and details of remote viewing. Remote viewing was subsumed into the government as a thing called Project Stargate, and it was then operated by a wing of the government, and their services were made available to multiple governmental agencies, like the three-letter ones and other ones, for strategic purposes for a long period of time. And Ed ran that program. This book by Russell Targ is really far out. He's written this in the early 2000s, and it's replete with such beautiful stories. And it's also a book about Dzogchen, Tibetan Buddhism. Russell was a very deeply understanding, devoted, and very far out practitioner of Dzogchen. And you'll find many quotes from the Tibetan Book of Great Liberation in this book by Russell Targ, including, interestingly, to a translation of the Great Lib I don't have. I'm going to be going out and getting it, because the one Russell Targ used is different than the one that we have such a long relationship with at the San Francisco Lodge of the TS. So if you're looking for something kind of soothing, inspiring, mind-opening, topical, important, all of the above, go out and get this, Limitless Mind. Since I kind of re-affiliated with it, read it again, I've gone out and I've bought a couple of used copies to give to people. You can get a used copy of this that's in great shape for $7. And so take a trip to your favorite used book dealer and buy yourself a treat that's going to make you feel good about everything. He has beautiful stories in here about his daughter, who was a very advanced psychonaut and researcher in this field, and who helped him a lot in his work studying the remote viewing phenomenon at SRI. So that's it for tonight, and I wish all you folks the best. I hope that the days and weeks ahead are at least tolerable, and we all keep our feet under us and a smile on our faces at least part of the time. And all the best to all of you, and I'll see you again in a couple of months. Okay, bye. Jeff out.